it's lovely that we're finally having this conversation about everything energy transition. But before we get into this, I wanted to introduce John and tell you a little bit about him. We've had the privilege of working together now for the last 3 years, and hopefully we brought some great people into your team. But there's been some very, very exciting news on your side, as you recently left SDCL and set up your new business, which is something we're going to talk about today, alongside the energy transition space, which is something you're passionate about, something that you're trying to target. So John, without further ado, please, can you introduce yourself? Because I just don't think that I'll do it as much justice as you can.
Yeah, sounds good. Daniel, great to see you. As you said, been working with you for 3 years or more now. Great relationship. You know, put a great guys into our team. And look, I'm sure we'll work together in the new role as well. In terms of background, I suppose for my sins, all I've ever been in is energy, I suppose, infrastructure. And well, it wasn't called energy transition sort of 10 or 15 years ago. I started out at Centrica. That was good fun, working in a utility, you know, doing lots of great things, from selling our power stations and buying residential supply businesses and tons of stuff in between. I spent 5 years or more on pure advisory. We were advising clients across Europe, North America, did some...
So, so you'd moved on from Centrica at that point?
I had, absolutely. So and that was in about 2016, and yeah, we did some great deals. I mean, we did some of the first unsubsidized renewable projects in Europe back in 2017, when Spain and Portugal was kind of coming back, and that was good fun. But it was, you know, it was classic kind of advisory, capital raising, buy side, sell side M&A, pretty much in renewables. Across Europe, North America. And then the last 2.5 years before I launched my own venture, I was back to the buy side, and I was helping to lead the investment team out of London for a group called Sustainable Development Capital. Great firm. We, you know, we did a lot of great deals in that time. They were one of the largest investors in energy efficiency, decentralized generation globally. So that was great. But I really kind of wanted to go and launch my new venture, which we'd actually spoken about for quite a while. And, you know, I think OME Capital, or as you'd called it, OME Capital, which I think it might...
You know what, I've got to say, you know, I like the sound of OME Capital. And yeah, we just had a chat there before we kicked off. You know, I think I might have just rebranded the business, but it sounds like everyone else is doing it. But you know what, a name is just a name. It's more about the vision of the leader behind the business. It's just interesting about your career, really. You don't often see people that have gone, you know, from industry to advisory to buy side. And I think that kind of journey, you know, sort of 14 years ago when you started out, it wasn't really possible. You know, you had to follow that path of going from investment banking to get into the buy side. And I think it's a beautiful thing, really, that now we're seeing that in the marketplace. And you know, you are a wonderful case study for that. I think the really, really interesting thing is that, you know, it's not about wind, it's not about solar so much. Yes, storage is interesting, but what I love about what you do and what I love about where the market is going is this piece of energy transition. What does that mean to you? What are the sectors? What are the geographies? Just tell us more about your vision about energy transition and why it's so hot at the moment.
Yeah, of course. Now, an energy transition is kind of, I mean, to a lot of people, it's a new phrase. I mean, if you go back 10 years ago, you could sort of hardly get people interested in renewables. We were having that first big wave in Europe, and renewables was embedded somewhere into broad general infrastructure funds. And then, of course, what we started to see was renewable funds branch out and be sole renewable funds. And then, of course, now we've got energy transition funds. But when people think about energy transition, what they actually think about is just, let's just build lots of renewables. Well, actually, renewables alone is going to be a very small part. Well, I say a small part, it's going to be a quarter roughly of all the emissions by 2050 will come from, you know, reduction in emissions will come from renewables. So that kind of means, what are the other things there? Well, you've got the electrification of transportation. You're going to have the decarbonisation of heat, which is going to require 5 times more energy than renewables. EV. And of course, you've got energy efficiency, which, my old firm SDCL, we were kind of pioneers in that, and nobody talked about it. And now there's this kind of, novel idea that actually, rather than just keep building it, you could also use less as well. So you've got this whole host of other things that are alongside renewables that contribute to this energy transition actual story, and you need them all, right?
You completely do. And you know what, I'm actually feeling the excitement in the market now. I mean, look, we're looking at these large scale solar and wind deals. We've seen them all running across Europe over the last couple of years, and things have changed. Power prices have changed, interest rates are all over the place. And clearly the returns aren't there, are there? So I think there's two things, isn't there? There's the sustainable journey, but there's also the investment case, and there's an upside, and there clearly is a greater upside for investors investing in this space. So I think that the listeners are probably going to want to know about both. But I think from my side of things, I'm going to put you straight in there. What of those subsectors of this energy transition space, where are investors, where should they really be looking for the next 12 months?
Yeah, so look, I think this ties into one of the things that we're launching within OME Capital, which is our first, if you like, our flagship platform. What a lot of investors are now, it's crazy to think that and I will get to the answer. It's crazy to think that renewables was in a infrastructure sector and then suddenly it broke out, and now we've actually got investors calling renewables and utility scale storage core energy transition and everything else non-core. So you're really getting a sector, subsectors within energy transition. So for me, it's going to be in things like sustainable transportation. I think if you look at EVs, it's a very fragmented market. There's barriers to deployment in certain areas. I think you're going to see quite a bit of consolidation. And actually, if you look at the trajectory that we need to actually put infrastructure in behind the electric vehicle targets, I mean, I think to hit net zero, we have to be at 60% EVs by 2030, which is a phenomenal kind of a step up. Will that be done? I don't know. The other area that we're really focusing on and actually really passionate about is distributed generation. And by distributed generation, I mean on-site generation, behind the meter, rooftop solar, behind the meter storage, and other technologies within the built environment. And the reason we see massive growth for that is, well, one, I suppose there's quite low penetration in the market today anyway, which obviously helps with your growth trajectories. But if you look at places like the UK, I mean, people are getting themselves in a panic about grid connections and deployment of utility scale renewables and storage. But actually, everything we're focusing on is around distributed generation, so it's on site. So it's, we're having very limited sort of issues with grid because most of the generation that we produce is consumed on site. Energy storage behind the meter, no one's talking about it because they're talking about how in front of the meter will balance large scale utilities scale renewables, and that's absolutely right. But actually behind the meter is going to play a massive role because not only have you got helping customers with revenues and costs, resiliency is a key piece. Nobody talks about that, actually providing power quality and resiliency on site. And the third one that people are starting to now talk about is what we're calling congestion management. So with all the kind of grid constraints around the UK and other markets, if I want to expand my office block and add 10 EV chargers on site, well, how am I going to get my grid connection? How am I going to get that extra capacity?
You're completely right. Listen, obviously, we know about what's going on with the grid, and there's been lots and lots of publicity about it at the moment. And I think it's an interesting one to touch on. And it's an interesting, concept to look at as to why, an investor would get more confident in looking at this more sort of energy transition space. But can we touch on that a bit further? Can you let the listeners know more about the problems with the grid in the UK at the moment and why we are at this point?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's just, quite frankly, there's been a lack of investment over many years. And then what's happened is we've suddenly ended up with tens of gigawatts of applications going into the grid, and there is just not a way to facilitate the grid connections in the time frame that people expect. I mean, I saw, you know, Octopus and other groups complaining about 2035 grid connections. So you have to believe that some of those will be solved. But, you know, a 2030 grid connection doesn't suddenly become a 2025 grid connection, right? I mean, I think it's fair to say that whilst they will be sorted out, the problems around grid are going to persist over the next decade. And actually, you know, to go back to your point, where do I think are the opportunities? Look, there's over 100 renewable funds in Europe doing utility scale. So if I was here today telling you I was launching a new renewable fund, I'd honestly expect you to tell me, John, you should probably do something else, because, you know, it's going to be very tough. Whereas we haven't done that. So we focused on all of the other things. So on-site generation, behind the meter storage, the built environment, decarbonisation of heat, very high growth sectors that still only have maybe a few tens of players in, not 100+ players. And the pricing is better, of course. They're less competitive, they're underserved. So that's where, you know, they're the areas where we're focusing.
Yeah, no, listen, absolutely. And I think that with all of that, you can also see, you know, we talked about there being sort of 100+ funds across the UK and Europe at the moment. You know, lots of those are kind of altering their strategy now. And, you know, first they started taking more development risk, you know, which was, you know, profound. We'd never seen that happening before. You know, funds setting up development teams. You know, we've seen it with people like the Downing, and we also saw it with Cubico changing their investment strategy. And I think that, you know, without mentioning names now, we're starting to see these new funds being set up. But of course, where we are in the market at the moment, high interest rates, and I think confidence is down. So what we're seeing is, and maybe you're seeing the same, is I think lots of these funds are perhaps struggling at the moment to raise finance. That being said, I think the interesting thing about the type of transactions and the size of transactions that you're kind of looking at, and forgive me if I'm wrong, but this kind of sort of growth equity funding, this idea, do you think that is going to be easier to get that kind of funding in this market?
So look, it's never easy to get funding in the market, and I suppose this might actually be a good time, Daniel, to I suppose I suppose give the listeners, I guess, our thesis, because I think that's kind of what you're hitting on in that question. So where we see the gap in the market is around that growth equity, that platform building space, and that really comes from what we're seeing in the market. And you know, you're right, the fundraising market is not great, but what's actually happened is the capital raising market for firms and for opportunities is therefore not great as well. And what we actually see in the kind of, let's call it energy transition market, or it could even be the wider sustainable infrastructure market, is that for companies and groups and opportunities on the small scale, actually, I think it's in some ways never been easier to raise money on the small end. There are hundreds of venture funds. Let's be honest, there's EU grants galore. Every time I look, somebody's got a new grant. So actually, we said to ourselves when we sat down, for companies to raise a few 100,000, friends, family, high net worth grants, actually not too difficult in the current market. Most people could. And then, of course, as we've spoken, and many of your clients fall into this bucket, once you've got 20 or 30 people and a large platform and operational assets, there'll be 100 funds coming over the hill to try and have a look. But actually what that's created is what we call the wedge in the middle, where there's actually lots of good opportunities that need 10 to 50, 10 to 30 million. And they're not quite in the sweet spot of infrastructure, because let's be honest, their appetite's getting bigger. You know, they used to want 50 to 100. Now they want 200. So that's created a big gap in the middle. And that's kind of why we started OME Capital, because we felt there was a really good opportunity to come in behind specific energy transition strategies and actually build platforms. Our whole thesis is about platform building. And what we made the sort of bet on, which goes back to your earlier question, was that larger infrastructure funds would work with us to outsource the execution of that build, because their usual question is, John, can I deploy 100 in the first 6 months? And the answer is no.
That's interesting. That's very interesting, John. So is OME, are you also offering an advisory service as well?
Yeah, look, so I think if you ask me, majority of our customers over the longer term, or clients, will be larger infrastructure funds as opposed to companies. Okay. And the reason I think that is because what we do is, you'll hear a lot of people talk about platform building, and that's what we do. And I think about platform building as something that's very specific, which is you find a strategy, you make it much more around being a capital platform, something that can facilitate capital into the market with the whole view of exiting, the whole view of exiting. You'll see a lot of businesses have been running 10, 15 years. Okay. Does the CEO want to sell? Maybe he does. Did they build themselves ready for sale? Probably not, right? But everything we do is about building for sale, maximizing exit. So I actually think a lot of our clients will be large infrastructure funds. And if you look at our sort of flagship vehicle, which is all around distributed generation, and so rooftop solar, behind the meter storage, our pitch to the large infrastructure funds is, if you think this market is great and you think there's high growth and you'd like to be in it, okay, you can't write 100 million in six months, but outsource the build and the execution risk to us. In 12, 24 months time, you will be able to put your couple 100 million to work. And guess what? You won't have to go into a process, and you won't have to be competing against another 50 or 100 funds. Because, you can't service that inside your 5 billion fund through your investment team. Outsource the build to us. And that's actually our pitch at the moment, and that's resonating pretty well. And if you look at the US, if you look at the US market, which actually is probably 5, maybe a bit more ahead on DG platforms, a lot of those have changed hands. EQT have bought one, Brookfield have bought one, Macquarie have one. Those groups are probably 5, 6 years ahead, but they got that. They weren't trying to do DG sat inside their own platform. And you're
quite right. Even a couple of months ago, I noticed that Diff had acquired Pinnacle Power. Again, that sort of private equity, energy transition style investment. It's a great play, and I think that if you're not making those plays, you're going to be left behind. Something that I just want to touch with you, and something I want to ask you a bit more about. I just want to get into it a bit further. We're talking about behind the meter and in front of the meter, and obviously it's all about behind the meter. Can you just go into it a little bit more about, apart from the obvious, what are the advantages there for a behind the meter style investment, and why is that taking front stage at the moment?
Well, look, I think a lot of it comes down to competition and deployment. I mean, as we said before, if I was trying to compete with a lot of large scale renewable funds, it's it's a race to the bottom now. It's become very commoditized. So everyone's looking at what's the next thing, what's the next growth market. So it's a higher growth market over this decade, I think, because it's coming from a lower base. And it's less competitive at the moment. So naturally, these are the areas where we want to operate. I never want to be in front of the curve. I always kind of want to be sort of coming in the first couple, or relatively as it's building. That's where you want to be. And look, there's great growth from it, because as we said, I think all the drivers have aligned, right? I mean, even compared to a couple of years ago, it was quite difficult to sell DG solutions, rooftop solar to commercial and industrial customers in Europe. But now what we found is, post-COVID, Ukraine-Russia conflict, I mean, power prices had gone up 2 or 3 times or more. Gas prices were up 10 times. So now you've got customers actually where it makes economic sense. ESG, I mean, 10 years ago, you couldn't get it on a radar. Now people are saying we have to do it, rather than
no choice.
There's no choice. And then, of course, the third one all links back to security supply. Russia-Ukraine conflict has caused, I mean, look at Europe. I mean, we went from 40% gas imports from Russia down to 10%. That's not going back. So we're exposed over the next number of years to price volatility if we have cold winters. And a lot of clients don't want to go through that again. So I call it the market drivers have aligned now that actually makes this DG business across UK and Europe actually scalable for the first time. And that's how I would sort of summarize it. Plus, we're seeing still a good uplift on returns versus utility scale. And of course, that will naturally start to close. But you're right, investors are moving in. A lot of the big guys are there. Diff as well. You mentioned Pinnacle. They bought a light as well. So there's quite a few groups starting to move into that space.
Absolutely. So I think for investors, for funds that are looking at this space, it's a bit of a whirlwind, isn't it? There's kind of lots and lots of pieces coming in together. And I think sometimes when you look at it, you kind of really need to kind of summarize it down. So with that, and I think we touched on it at the start, but what are the subsectors that you see that those solid subsectors of this space that people should be looking at when they're trying to kind of put things in boxes, I suppose?
Yeah, look, I say 4 sectors, right? I say my kind of 4 hot sectors for this decade would be, as you've heard me kind of bang on about for most of this interview, is DG, so rooftop solar behind the meter storage, massive growth this decade. The second would be sustainable transportation. As we said, we're behind our targets for infrastructure rollout. It's honestly a bit cowboy out there at the moment, Daniel. So I think a lot of us are actually talking about when will consolidation start to really happen in that market. And I think there's a really good consolidation play there around sustainable transportation. The third is heating and cooling, right? The built environment.
I'm such a massive fan of this, by the way. Again, what the Pinnacle side of things, we talked about that. I just love this so much. I just think it's so clever.
It is. I mean, you've got buildings, 30% of all energy produced is used in buildings, right? And as I said, I think the decarbonisation of heat is going to take about 5 times more power than the electrification of vehicles. So it's a massive market, right? So I expect to see decarbonisation of heat. That's my third one. That will dominate. And then the fourth one, it's not a bigger market as people think, but there's a lot of players really now moving in Europe, and that's around sort of bioenergy and waste, right? And actually, even if you convert a lot of the power plants to green gas and so on, it will still represent actually a relatively small part versus natural gas.
It's enormous, isn't it? It really is. And we're just going off in different directions and just seeing where the possibilities are. It's absolutely, bioenergy in itself. There's so many products and there's so many offerings around that just in itself. We obviously only ever knew it in one strain, but now there's so much more interest. So perhaps you can see these investors running at let's say the anaerobic digestion space. A couple of years ago, people were staying away from it because the technology didn't seem to work. But now everyone's kind of running at it because they're thinking, well, we'll get the technology working, and then on the back of that, there's just so many great opportunities.
Yeah, and Daniel, a lot of this has been accelerated by COVID and the Ukraine-Russia conflict. I mean, a lot of it goes back to that. I mean, why is green gas and bioenergy sort of very popular? Because gas prices are still very high, and therefore green gas is even more valuable. Why do DG solutions make sense now? Because payback periods have come down. Why? Because prices have increased. So
what happens when the prices come down?
Well, prices have already started to steady a bit within the power markets, the gas markets in Europe. They're still, I mean, it depends who you speak to and which rates. They're still at least a couple of times higher than they were. And yes, they may tail off a bit over time, but I don't think we're going back to those type of prices in a short to mid term. You're going to have all sorts of funky stuff happening with the market when we have very high penetration of renewables. We're going to get back to lots of negative pricing during the day when it's very hot and it's very windy. But remember, that's wholesale prices. Retail prices represent a ton of other costs and commodity. It's about 50-50. So even if you do something on the commodity side, you don't get rid of the customer's bill. If anything, you've still got to pay for the grid. You've still got to pay for all those things. If you look at an average commercial and industrial customer's bill, it's about 50%. I mean, it does vary a lot. It's gone up even more now. But we used to run on 50-50.
It must be difficult. It must be difficult though, when you're, looking at these opportunities, when you're building the financial model around it, because of course, the power prices do offer and can change an investment very, very quickly. But I'm assuming you're being fairly conservative on them and knowing that they're never going to get back to where they were, but will come down slightly.
Well, I think this is the beauty again for investors with with behind the meter solutions. A lot of the customers we're looking at, and we've got everything in our pipeline, from football stadiums to ports to whatever. Majority of those customers are consuming everything we produce at a fixed rate PPA. So I actually have very little exposure to power prices. That's the reality. So that's even, that even appeals to infrastructure investors even more. There's actually limited merchant exposure in a lot of the deals we're looking at.
And again, another great highlight of why behind the meter is where people need to be looking at the moment. Look, we've touched upon geographies slightly. We talked about the UK. We talked about Europe. But an interesting question is actually, what are the specific geographies? Where are the hot places? Is there one that's more specific? Is there a place that OME are maybe focusing on more?
It really depends. I mean, I talked about my 4 hot sectors, right? That actually depends on country and market. So I would say, as a broad, to answer your question, we're really looking at kind of OECD markets, and it's Europe and North America. And within our verticals that we operate under energy transition, there's great opportunities in each of those markets, right?
With all of those geographies, with all of those regions, are there any kind of regulatory frameworks or anything that people would need to consider, or is there simply no barrier to entry because it is behind the meter?
Yeah, I mean, it depends. I mean, most of the investments we're looking at do not require regulatory support. But of course, you always have regulatory tailwinds. So is the government, is the market supportive of what you're doing? Because it doesn't just mean, I get some of my revenue from a regulatory body or government. It's more a case of, is the government supportive of what I'm doing? Planning, permitting, ability to scale. So it's minimal. And actually, if you look at, for the first time ever, really, the EU and the UK, right top of their energy policies, you have comments like energy efficiency is the first step. Energy efficiency is a key pillar of our energy strategy. So they're actually kind of front and center of what we're doing, right, and highly supportive. And so no, look, I think in all the things we're doing, there's no regulatory risk really, or very limited regulatory risk, and there's pretty good regulatory tailwinds behind most of what we're doing.
Okay. Listen, I'm going to be a bit cheeky here. I'll say it how it is.
Yeah, always.
I think it'd be nice to kind of, just before we go, maybe look at a case study, an actual investment that you're looking at the moment. I'm going to go straight out there, John. Is there anything you're working on at the moment that we can talk about openly?
I mean, if you want to look at some of the projects we're looking at, as we've got a transaction in the market at the moment called Project Skylight. What we've done is we have, we've obviously picked the distributed generation market in the UK and Europe as a key energy transition strategy. OME Capital has put together a team of about 6 professionals, high quality professionals. We put together
who's in the team? Anyone that we know?
You'd probably know a couple of them, Daniel, and there's a few that I couldn't mention because they're undisclosed, but you would know a couple. You would probably know a couple of them.
Okay. Good people then.
Very good people. If they've come from me, absolutely very good people. One of them has, and then we put together a pipeline. As I said, our pitch to capital is, if this is the market you want to be in, we have a ready-made capital platform, and capital is the key word. I'm not trying to be a developer. I'm not trying to be an installer. And so we've got a team, we've got a pipeline. Now, if you want to talk about some of that pipeline and some of the transactions, kind of what do you want to know?
I think it'd be lovely to kind of get a bit of a brief synopsis on was it Project Skylight?
Yeah.
Give us an overview on Project Skylight.
Sure. So as I said, our pitch to investors is focus on the DG market. We've got a high quality team. We've got investable pipeline on day one. Let us scale and manage that for you and all the way through to exit. What we're looking to raise is around £10 million for this year. That's to fund team and the initial transactable pipeline, which is key. If you haven't got a pipeline that investors can close on day one, it's very, very difficult. And then we're looking for around 150 million plus over the next, say, 3 to 5 years, equity. And I think we can go quicker given the pipeline we have. The target for investors, I'll be open on numbers. I think some people have seen some of our teasers, is you'd be looking to kind of make 15-20% plus on exit and a 2.5 to 3 times on your money. I mean, that's where we think the value is in platform, and ultimately a lot of the infrastructure funds who couldn't quite come in today, if we're successful, of course, will compete for that platform in 3 or 4 years' time to put their capital in, and they will come and pay the value. So that is
and kicking themselves as they do.
And kicking themselves, and we have to try, and that's what we're trying to play on, right? We're trying to play on, let us build this for you. So they're the sort of that's where we are. And at a sort of project level, what we're seeing at the moment, if it's, if it'd be interesting, is we're seeing PPAs with customers on site anywhere from 15 to 25 years, maybe even higher. The rates vary, but I think the market at the moment is still clearing in the kind of high unlevered single-digit IRRs and in the low double-digit levered IRRs. So that's kind of where we are in our return build-up for DG.
Interesting.
If that's given you a bit of a flavour without trying to give you too much. I mean, honestly, I think there's a couple hundred basis points uplift on utility scale renewables at the moment, but that will close. And
obviously, I'm sure if people were interested in maybe finding out a bit more about Project Skylight and potentially some involvement in that, I'm sure they can reach out to you directly, either via LinkedIn or maybe we'll put your contact details on the page at a later date so they can do that.
That would be great. Yeah, I mean, we're always looking for great projects to fund and looking for great team members as well who have experience in this space. Absolutely.
Yeah, no, I'll find the team members. You stay away from that.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, that's it. Well, that's it. We've been trying to do your job for the last few months, Daniel.
I've been trying to find you good people for years. They're fantastic. I think it's been great to kind of get an initial overview on OME Capital. I think it's been great to get an overview on you as a person and an overview on the energy transition space. There's clearly a tremendous amount of mileage across all of these subsectors, and I think that for any of my clients out there, any infrastructure funds in particular, I think if you are scratching your head, trying to raise capital at the moment, perhaps you should be, contacting people like John to kind of create an investment strategy. And I'm assuming that's something that you can do and you can offer as an advisor.
Absolutely. That's our philosophy, kind of outsource some of that initial platform build to us behind a good strategy, and we'll assemble all the pieces for you, right? That's our pitch at the moment. That's what we're doing with Skylight, and that's what we'll do with hopefully many other ones behind it.
No, absolutely. Look, as always, I love your energy, John. I've loved speaking to you today, and I kind of I think we should hold it there, and I think we should come back to this in a few months' time, because I know that we talked about before the call, before we started recording, there's just so much going on, and there's lots and lots and lots of those confidential projects. But I think I'm hoping that people will access you with these potential opportunities now. But we look forward to seeing how you grow and evolve across the space. I think a lot of people who are kind of probably working in roles at the moment as investment directors are probably thinking, admiring the fact that you've done this. And we take our hats off to you. There aren't many that are doing this. But what we do know is your offering is different and it's cutting edge. It's, in my opinion, right on the money. And I think everyone should be following suit.
Well, as always, Dan, I really appreciate that. And hopefully your viewers and listeners have enjoyed that. And as always, love catching up with you.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much for your time. And we look forward to speaking again in the coming months.
Look forward to it. Thanks,
John.
Thanks
Take care.
Always. Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.